I also would like to thank Resilience First for this event and giving us the opportunity to share some of the experiences. So today I would mainly talk about some of the lessons learned from China, some of the things I think are quite important from different perspectives, from urbanism, from urban design, urban planning, from urban management, and from, of course, resilience perspective. So I tried to summarize these as quick as possible, allowing for more questions to be taken later on. Next, please. So I think the reason why we are here is just because I think the city where we are at the moment, I think had quite a rapid reaction to the situation, and I have been helping also at least partly during this process as well to the city authorities. So I summarize it very quickly. So as from the top, the outbreak was announced officially on 20th of January. There are early signs of this disease as early as, officially as early as 16th of November. So this has been, I think 9th of January was the first time that there were a cluster of cases in the city of Wuhan. And gradually by 20th of January, this was then announced as an outbreak. And early measures were taken quite rapidly in China. So the city of Wuhan was actually on the lockdown as early as 23rd of January, and then the province was on 25th, the Hubei province, which is about 57 million people. Then by the time it came, it was already an epidemic of its own, and it actually was, I think by 29th of, if I'm not mistaken, by 28th or 29th of January, I think the whole provinces in China had the disease already, and also several countries, at least 4 or 5 countries. And so the city, some cities and some provinces were under immediate lockdown, and early measures were taken in place. And Ningbo was one of them on 28th, 29th. And it was then recognized as a global health emergency on 30th of January. So I decided to develop a new resilience framework, especially for cities and communities, and how we should deal with an outbreak on 2nd of February, and it was then passed to the local government, which was then later implemented by 17th of February. Ningbo was not hit much. The city, although it's quite a big city, it's a medium to large scale city, to give you the context, about 7 million people south of Shanghai. And we had 157 cases, and then we had quite a lot of, we had several weeks of lockdown, I think about 6 weeks in total, and we had an enhanced measures on containment happen by 3rd of March. All cases were treated. The borders were still closed for some time, and then we went to post-recovery phase as early as April 2020. Next, please. So I'm here I'm going to talk about lessons learned mainly from the perspective of what we have done or what has happened in here. I think that should apply to many countries as well, or many contexts. So the first lesson is about considering a holistic spatial management. This is something I actually tried to cover in a recent paper, and I was hoping the paper is already published, but it's actually in the last stages. So I think it would be published next week, which I talked about 10 adaptive measures for public places. And importantly, because we have a lot of public places, we have a lot of spaces around us that we have to make sure they are managed properly. We have to have adaptive measures to make sure we respond properly and adequately, of course. So as you can see from the photos, I've tried to be very much pictorial for this presentation. We have closure of secondary buildings. So this is a church in Ningbo, which was closed on 30th of January. And second picture in the middle, we have the closure of our secondary gates in the campus. So the secondary access points were all closed immediately as early as 28th of January. And in the third picture on the right, you see the example of in the temporary food collection point was put in place in front of one of the hospitals, which is not far from the campus. So there were quite immediate and responses to those spaces, and there were some adaptive measures which I think are important for us to learn from, and that's why I tried to summarize them in a very short, I think about 10 pages paper, hopefully out by next week. Next, please. The second one is actually paying attention to details in a reflective manner. I think mostly we look into the general aspects, but actually the details are important. So again, from left, I give you the examples of how these details actually developed. In the first one, we have food collection again in front of one of the drink shops, where and also you can see the barcode. So there were no cash transactions allowed. There were no entries to those shops allowed, and then the collections were allocated in front of those shops. In the second one, we have Didi, which is similar to Uber, and they have, I'm not sure if the slide is clear, but then they had this advertisement that driver body temperatures are monitored. Later, they had disinfection processes and everything, which was advertised in the application. And in the third part, on the top, it's on Chinese, but I'm not able to translate it myself. I can give you why I use this particular one. So here is a delivery which we had from food delivery from outside, and it was required by the local government that the person who wraps the delivery, the food delivery, and the person who delivers the food, the temperature should be measured, and this should be signed, and this should come with the receipt of your the food which is actually delivered to your home. So this is, again, these are the details and these are the regulations which require really to pay attention to details. At the bottom of it, we have an image of a lift, the buttons in the lift, where you can see a sellotape on the lift buttons, where again, it's good. Those are those buttons that are regularly used. They can get dirty quicker, and also they can get damaged as you put disinfection on a regular basis. And also it is easier to get rid of sellotapes, clean them, and you can put the new sellotape. So these are, again, details that are really important. And the last image is actually on our campus, just before we start teaching a few weeks ago, where we have an entry points to any teaching building. We do have temperature checks and records of any students and staff, anyone actually getting into the buildings and going out of the buildings. So again, those are quite simple but important and effective measures that were in place. Please, next one, please. And in here we have the lesson 3 is about how we can have checkpoints at communities and city levels. So I try to be talking about this very briefly. On the left picture, you can see no one could actually. This is a picture of a bridge to a village, and no one who were non-local resident could actually enter those villages. And you can see are local residents, and they had to have it in the checkpoint. They had to make sure they get the temperature and the records checked as well. And on the right side, you can see a person is not allowed into shopping mall, and then again at the checkpoint didn't have the right documentations in terms of getting into the place. In terms of they have a new health code system in here that you need to present before getting into premises, especially public buildings. And again, these are the things that are important, that we have checkpoints, and I already highlighted also in the paper which is coming out next week as well. Next, please. Here, well, the photo is not mine. This is what is familiar matter, so I wouldn't be around at that time. But this is a photo from World War II, where we have adaptive approaches. So we have early asset management and prioritization in terms of our production in particular. Where during the war, especially if we have a major war, then the collection of metal is important to produce tanks, at least at that time. And same thinking should apply to the situation as we are dealing with. So early asset management and prioritization are quite important. How we deal with our assets like transportation. So the airplanes couldn't go in and out perhaps, or they're reduced. They could actually bring in supplies, for example. And this is just a very simple example. Or some of the facilities could be utilized and prioritized for healthcare services or healthcare facilities, and put more emphasis on essential equipment and essential supply, including medical equipment, medication supply, food supply. And as well as that, you see, not only in China, but also other parts of the world now, the production also is changing and prioritizing for certain needs as well. So again, one sector can help and support another. This is exactly what we should try to reflect on as well. Next, please. And in here, I try to, in my book, actually, I try to address one major factor about how the national level, and I mentioned it, I think about 6 weeks ago in another webinar, that national level guidelines are often neglected by communities, or they are not easily implementable. So the important thing is that we can actually support or enhance regional level and local level administrations for implementation. At the end of the day, when it goes into implementation, it happens at the local community level. And again, this is something which is quite important. I put in here a few different examples from different countries: Australia, Thailand, Sweden, and the UK, where we do have different types of regional thinking. So our regions are very different in terms of scale. Like in Australia, each region probably are as big as, maybe not so populated in some parts, but are as big as few countries. Whereas the boroughs, for example, or the regional level in the UK are relatively smaller. So again, the opportunity for us to think about regional planning, as well as regional management are quite important, and those are really effective, as we've seen in China in particular as well over the past few months. Next, please. So lesson number 6 is about how we can have adaptive measures and planning. The left image is actually one of my favorite images. It's when the construction was just started, and the details of the image are quite nice, because then normally it takes a few minutes for the construction workers to go back home, but then in this process, and I tried, yes, I had a lot of time at that time, I managed to sit down and watch all of the construction workers passing by, but then they free them almost like every 5 minutes in groups of less than 10. And also, you may not be able to see very clearly in the image, but they were also supervisors standing in each node, making sure they go through the same route and going in and out of the premises. So again, those are really important in terms of how we change our business as usual management or anything like that comes underneath that. And the very right side in the image, we do have also another example of the entries to restaurants and bars. Well, actually, bars are not yet, some of them are not open, but restaurants, when they open, they have to have temperature checks, records, and all those things need to be in place. Masks should have been used, and also the disinfection should have been used before actually getting into the building or getting into the restaurants. Again, those are the things that have been quite important in terms of keeping those more populated areas to be safe. And in the middle, I always think about, in the middle, I have 2 images that I think about adaptive measures. So I was, maybe I could get criticized about, but I was quite against having the idea of spending quite a lot of money and time on sending letters to every household in the UK several weeks ago, mainly because that money could have been utilized in a right way. And I know that letters are a common way of communication for many places, but we have to think about adaptive, we have to have a different approach rather than having the business as usual approach. And again, those are quite important so we have to actually reflect on those as well. And at the bottom, we have police in Italy, where they have empowered the security and safety services as much as possible to make sure. And this wasn't happen, of course, in a normal situation, but in this situation, the person is trying to make sure that there are checkpoints to make sure everyone is checked before getting into certain communities. Next, please. So in here, I always argue that the early high-level measures are actually more effective than later restrictions. So I think one of the successful points in here we have is that we don't have a centralized hospital in Ningbo. We actually have several hospitals. And the important thing is that to keep those facilities, those teams to be safe and secure they should be priority. So one thing which happened in Ningbo and was really successful was that not all hospitals were allocated for receiving the patients, and actually there were district level hospitals that they were allocated. And luckily we have multiple hospitals, but then keeping certain number of hospitals to receive patients were quite important. And again, at the front there were a lot of in front of the hospital. This is the image on the left, is the front of the hospital in our district, where they actually put a lot of measures as early as possible to make sure that because they can actually be quite dangerous. Yeah, lessons number 8, please. Next slide. Yeah, in here we have the one thing which is quite important. A lot of research has been done on this particular matter, is about involvement and inclusion of communities and community representatives. So in a way, bringing back people, in China, it was quite effective to see that happening very quickly. We have volunteers on the ground. Even at the university, we have volunteers picking up the students from the stations, delivering things, delivering food to the students who are in the quarantine. So these are the things that are important and involve the community, because by involving the community, we can actually gain community support. We can address community issues more precisely, and we can have community responses or community level responses. And in a way, we can build up trust through that process. And I do believe good governance, in fact, is including both government and people. Next, please. And in here, I think I'll try to summarize some points in terms of how we can make good use of our right platforms. When we are at the age which is quite different to, let's say, when SARS happened 20 years ago or 18 years ago, to be precise. And we have a lot of technologies, we have a lot of online platforms. Probably 18 years ago, we couldn't have a webinar as we are having now to share some of the opinions or discussions. But at the same time, we have to be very cautious. We have a lot of fake news, fake media, fake information. Those misinformation can actually cause severe problems to the society, which can actually be quite troublesome in the long run. So we have to be very cautious. And the things that we can learn from this process was that the media management, I think, is quite important. That it should be official. It should be the right source that people could access. Because with availability of social media and many different media, people could get different information from different places. The other, of course, the usual suspects, I would say, is that online teaching, for example, for us was quite important that we try to boost this type of approach to our teaching. And the other two examples I have on the right side is about how informative the platforms can be. And of course, there's one example I put on the very right end that is about this is an online symptom checker, so people could actually put information. They don't have to go to doctors, so they can actually try to interact with doctors and nurses online. So these are the things, these platforms, 20 years ago, we didn't have them, but now we do have. And I think we should make sure we utilize them in the right way and in the best possible way. Last slide, please, next slide. And in here, we do have a recommendation I gave several weeks ago to some colleagues as well, and I would say, and here again, is wearing a facial mask in public is important. It's not something to. It's a simple thing to do, but in reality, it's a two-sided thing. So I think learning from the Japanese culture in here, I think would be good to protect the others. So it's important that when you wear a mask, you actually can protect the others as well. So there are studies concluded a few weeks ago by some researchers actually based in the UK that when we cough or when we sneeze, the particles or the droplets can actually pass up to 8 meters. That's quite worrying in a way. So in a way that you can see from the image, if the cough can, the particles from the cough can actually reach up to 2 meters. So social distancing is part of or physical distancing. It's only part of the image. But in fact, if we do manage to cover our faces, not all faces, of course, of the mouths, then it actually can be a possibility to reduce the chances of transmitting the disease to others, or actually protecting ourselves as well. So I think it's a simple measure, but it's very effective in the long run as well. Next, please. So this is the last slide. I hope I didn't overrun, and I just summarized some of the points from the book, which has been mentioned earlier on the city in need, and it's due to come out in the next 1 or 2 months. So it's just in the final stages of the publication. So if there is any question, I'm more than happy to take them as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really helpful, really, really nicely presented. There are a few questions. I'm going to start at the top. What are the lessons from China with regard to the importance of rapid behavior change in altering people's perceptions and expectations of the new normal for the duration of the emergency? And then are there lessons around messaging and communication, which I think you touched on in your point 9?
Okay, I'll answer this question now. Yes, I mean, unfortunately, the pandemic is still going on, and it's actually escalating in some countries at the same time that we went into post-recovery phase. And even in China, we have on and off cities are on the lockdown, or provinces get still cases coming or having new cases emerging. So still we are under this post-recovery, I would say, and I mentioned in the book as well, post-recovery under the shadow of fear, almost global fear. But then one thing which is important is that yes, we do have a bit of, I would say, normalization, or going back to normal, some of the operations, but everything is on the full high level measure. So we do have still unconscious, we do have 3 weeks passed and the students are on campus, they are not allowed to go off campus, for example. We do have every single premises you enter these days, you have the temperature checked. You need to have the green code to be green health code, we call it in here. So you have to present that to be able to enter premises. You have to wear masks in public places. One thing which is important is that those measures shouldn't be taken off completely. So in a post-recovery phase, it needs to be a gradual transition, as we see also the gradual transition of everything escalating at the beginning. Also, going back to normal should still be on the I would say a very high level measures in place for safety and prevention.
Sure, great, thank you. I think we'll move on to Hank Cole. As I mentioned, he is the head of business continuity and incident management at HSBC, and he's going to offer their perspective on coping with the pandemic. Hank, over to you.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name's Hank Cole. I'm the global head of business continuity and incident management for HSBC, which essentially means my role in life is to keep the bank functioning when it hits any kind of crisis, and to help the executive board manage the incident as and when it happens. I'd like to kick off with a very short video that looks at sort of traffic control in 2 or 3 different places. It's a 45-second video, and then I'll click on with my presentation. Show the video. Doesn't seem to be working. Shall I carry on? Yeah. Okay. So unfortunately, we'll perhaps try and play that again at the end. But look, just to give you some background from HSBC, and I apologise, my slides are extremely low tech compared to Ali's fantastic diagrams. So a 2-minute history of HSBC. We've been going for 154 years. We've got a massive asset base. Depending on how you measure bank size, we're either 1st, 2nd, 4th or 9th in the world in terms of size. We're in 64 countries or markets. We distinguish between the markets because in China, for instance, although geographically and in terms of government, China, Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan are all part of one country. In reality, for us, they're 4 separate markets. We've got about 250,000 employees in those countries, give or take some contractors, some consultants and others. In terms of retail banking, we're about 3,400 branches, 380 corporate buildings worldwide. And interestingly, and making life complicated for me, 60% of our office staff are in only 34 buildings worldwide. So you can imagine we've got some buildings with really large numbers of people. And from a business continuity perspective, we divide that whole HSBC world into about 8,500 different departments. So in a normal day, i.e. when we're not suffering from a global pandemic, or we're not suffering from hurricanes or famine or locusts or whatever is impacting on our business, we run a business continuity cycle, which essentially means that we ask every department within the bank to do a business impact analysis. In other words, what's the impact on their ability to serve our customers if something goes wrong? We then ask them to come up with a business continuity plan, and then we ask them to test it. And that's an annual cycle. They do it every year. We run their testing for them, we assess it for them, and then we give them our feedback on whether their plan is good enough. I said I was running business continuity and incident management. They are 2 slightly different bits, although they are interesting to the extent that there is an overlap. So in other words, when we manage an incident, very often we go into business continuity, but there are incidents that take place that don't require us to make changes. And for those that don't understand business continuity as a concept, the idea is that we manage every incident we've got under 3 what we call interruption scenarios. So either we've lost a building, we've lost people, or we've lost some kind of technical support. And pretty much every incident you can imagine falls into one of those 3 categories. So that's a bit of background to give you an idea of the size and scale. Of course, what happens when we deal with something like COVID-19, if you can go to the next slide, please, is that we get all of those scenarios all at once. So we lose our buildings, we lose some of our people, we lose some of our technical resource. How do you manage that and keep a bank that serves 40 million customers worldwide functioning? So it's a tough call. I'm not going to go into all the things that we've done and how we've done them. I just want to call out a few of the issues we've had, some of the things that perhaps we did well, some of the things that we didn't do so well, and some of the things that are critical in managing an incident. So call it a crisis. I think one of the issues that we have with what you might call a rising tide event like COVID-19, which, as Ali says, probably started sometime in November. No one paid very much attention, at least until Christmas. And then it slowly impacts first China, then Asia Pacific, and then heads westwards. So not impacting everybody at the same time, but we're now in a situation where it impacts absolutely everybody all the time. And when do you call that a critical incident or a crisis? And what does that mean when you do? So having some triggers for what is a crisis, whether it's a local one, a global one, really important. Visible leadership, I'll talk about a bit later. I do want to talk about crisis and critical infrastructure, because the idea of doing our contingency planning on an annual basis is that we don't have to do the planning when the wheel falls off. So the idea being that we simply put those plans into place. But we've never had a situation where we've had to put all of our departments worldwide into business continuity mode at the same time, or at least for the same event. So having those structures in place are really important. So we run at a country level, sometimes at a site level, and sometimes at a regional level, major incident groups. And those major incident groups have the senior decision makers around the table to discuss the issues of the day around crisis management. And those incident groups that we test and train and exercise on at least an annual, but very often a monthly basis, have proved very successful. We've had 75 of those running simultaneously around the world, which translates into about 1,500 meetings, crisis meetings over the past 4.5 months, and they've worked really well. And in the middle of that is a crisis coordination group that I chair on a daily basis, that sits in the middle and tries to coordinate the lessons that we've learned, which is on to my next point of global to local to global. So there are some things that need to be managed nationally because of regulatory, legal, cultural, country specific issues, and some that need to be managed on a globally consistent basis, like global communication, like legal communication, like communication to our customers and clients, who are in lots of areas global clients, not just national ones. We've done a good job, I think, historically on prioritizing our processes and people. So in other words, if you can only do X% of your processes, which ones do you choose to do to make sure that you're actually servicing your customers to the optimum, and which ones can you leave and do another day? So if you're processing payments for customers, that's clearly a priority for a bank. That said, the press section in a particular country will still have its business continuity plan, but it's clearly not as important or as impactful if it doesn't work as the payments would be. So having that level of ability to prioritize your people and your processes, absolutely fundamental. Communication reporting is really interesting. Some of it, again, has to be done at a national level, some of it even at a site level, and it needs to be consistent. So one of the reasons we have a coordination group that sits in the middle is that we don't have wildly divergent messaging going to our employees who work for the same country that says different things at different times to different people. One of the things that certainly I've learned is, and I've put that old quote down there, I can't remember who said it, success has 1,000 fathers, failure is an orphan. There are lots of people who are keen to be seen to be responsible for what goes well, and less so when it doesn't go so well. So interesting psychology around that. And we've, I think, used the lessons learned, particularly from Asia and particularly from China and Hong Kong, and allowed the other parts and regions of the world to learn from those lessons and get them into their plans early, knowing that this COVID disease was coming their way. In terms of China specifically, we've got about 30,000 employees in China. We've got a functioning retail and commercial bank, and as well as that, we've got a massive set of technical support centres and global servicing centres. So managing customer facing roles for payments, for debit cards, for credit cards, and all that good banking stuff. So lots of people. And moving them from essentially work into contingency sites and then to home from working is a massive undertaking for 30,000 people. And we've done the same thing since in India, where we've got 50,000, and in some other big markets like the UK, where we've got 47,000 people. Getting them from the office to home has been a massive undertaking, both technically and psychologically as well as physically. A really interesting lesson in whether your contingency plans actually work. We've done, I think, a reasonable job of that. Supply of laptops, desktops, and getting people into the mode of working from home and doing the same thing is not a straightforward operation. I've talked about communications. I'll talk about triggers to return as the last bit, because I think that's really important. But somebody talked about what the new normal looks like. So to use China as an example, our new normal for office occupancy is likely to be about 75% of what it was pre-COVID or in 2019. Not just from an efficiency perspective, but also I think we've learned some good lessons about what works well in terms of remote working and what doesn't work so well, and who works better remotely and who worked better from an office. So I think, although I wouldn't necessarily agree with Jez Staley from Barclays, who says the days of the massive corporate office are over, I think the days of smaller corporate offices are about to begin. I've put slower is ultimately quicker. There have been some occasions where we've tried to move too quickly, either moving from the office to home or the reverse. We've gone too quickly. We've exposed ourselves too quickly to whether it's pandemic issues or other issues caused by the virus, and we've gone too quickly. So slower is ultimately quicker. And I think in relation to the return to work, which I'll talk about in a minute, we have designed a number of triggers around that. But one of the biggest lessons for me is essentially just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that goes for moving from the office to home, and certainly for the reverse move. And I'll talk about this trigger in a second. And I've put staff confidence down at the end. This is a massive issue for us. So the psychology of moving 250,000 employees from essentially an office working environment into a home working environment, and leaving aside some of the critical staff that have had to continue to work from offices throughout, those in some of the branches, some of our traders, and some of the other critical functions that we've got. That issue of moving from the office to home is psychologically really significant for our workers, and the reverse will be true as we start to recover the workplace. I think the last thing I'll talk about, and normally if I was going to talk about this whole subject, it would take me a couple of hours to go through this properly, and I'd welcome some questions at the end. We've designed a series of external and internal triggers that signal that it may or may not be safe for us to return to work, and some of these are in place right now. So in China, we're back at 75% occupancy of our offices. In other countries in the world, we're at 2% of occupation of our offices, because that's simply the nature of the cycle of the virus and the level of exposure we're prepared to have with social distancing and the like. So some external factors. We've for the UK decided that we'd need to see at least a 14-day consistent drop in the death rate with using a 5-day average, and no new clusters or waves emerging. We'd need to see the government public health response restrictions lifted. We'd need to see freedom of movement. Healthcare system needs to be able to cope with both the current rounds of COVID levels and to be able to cope with the future wave. Test and trace programs need to be up and running and efficient. And there are some others, nurseries and schools. Obviously, to take schools as an example, there are many of our operators who, whilst schools are not functioning, are not going to be easily returned to the office. And then we've got some internal triggers there, which I won't bore you by going through, but these are some of the factors that we'll take into account as and when our major incident groups for each country, who have the autonomy to make these decisions, start to think about recovering. So we've written some very, very detailed plans, both global plans, as a 30-page document we put together that talks about the considerations to make, and then every country has its own plans. And for some of our bigger buildings, like Canary Wharf in London, where we've got routinely 9,000 people in the office on a normal day, today we've got 214 people in there. So big plans. If you need to maintain social distancing, that means you've really got to organise your office properly. So all of these are things that I've had to take account. That is really a whistle-stop tour through what we do and how we do it, but really happy to take some questions either now or afterwards.
Marvellous. Thank you so much, Hank. That was really informative, really useful. We do have some questions, but I think we're going to go across to Zhang, who's going to, I think, give her observations as an urban designer on kind of, what she's seeing and how she thinks this will kind of affect that moving forward. Eco.
Hi, thank you, Carolina, for the introduction, and thank you, Ali and Hank, for the thoughtful presentation. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought challenges to every country in the world. But it's one thing that was really interesting to point out, because I'm Chinese. So the Chinese word for crisis, 危机, is actually a combination of the word danger and the word opportunity, which could be a very strong way to see the current situation. We all have the opportunity to do things that we could not have done before. So the first thing I'd like to point out, which both Hank and Ali has mentioned in their presentation, is that detail matter. This applies to all phases of the strategy, from response phase to transaction, which we are getting into right now in the UK, and to the preparation for the future. Similar to what Hank has presented, as a global company ourselves, that we are starting the phased return by first establish a new office capacity using physical distancing analysis to design a new office seating arrangement. Then to plan the employee return approach, taking employees' transport mode, client needs, and on-site support into consideration, almost on a person-by-person basis, but it's also a voluntary thing. As Hank has pointed out, that staff confidence to do business in this time is very important. And thirdly, I think it's important also to establish and communicate new office protocols. Operational changes in the working environment needs to be revised and involved for resiliency. This could include small detailed things like providing protective equipment for employees to help them reduce their anxiety of being back together in one space. things like enhancing maintenance standards to make employees feel comfortable that the physical environment around them are under control. And also things like developing internal employee health recording system, which has been already implemented in our Shanghai office. So all of these above details will help reinforce the new behaviors that help companies adapting into the new phase and preparing us for the future working environment. The second summary and response, I think, is perhaps innovation and adaptation. As Ali has mentioned, we see that the system in China allows medical staff and supplies from other cities, regionally, even nationally, able to shift into Wuhan when it was in great need, and then dissolve gradually to its local level when the peak has passed. Many factories in China have also adapted its production line to cope with the high demand for medical equipment. I was personally very proud when I heard that some electric automation factories have adopted their production line quickly to produce face masks with a record of almost 1.4 million per day, with need only 5 to 6 staffs to operate the production line. Similarly, this has happened in the UK, from large companies to small specialized engineering companies, and private labs have switched to help the NHS testing kit. And there has been a massive pull to coordinate locally to fill the emergency supply chain gaps. I think this type of innovation and quick adaptation of industries and sectors is a vital example of resiliency at this particular time. And finally, as pointed out by both speakers throughout the presentation, I think technology here is a key in this pandemic. We can't still, as Ali said, approach things business as usual. There has to be some innovation in technology and changes that needs to take into place. I think we all know that China now actually ranks first globally in smartphone ownership. The fast-growing social media app WeChat has already been able to cover almost all aspects of daily routine digitally, from barcode payment to paying your utility bills and other basic public services like booking a doctor appointments, all in one app. Ali also mentioned about the health green code, which you need to scan in order to do things in public. From what I learned, that this type of technology has been quickly introduced to help ease the pandemic in public space and public amenities. The metro system in Shanghai has introduced a barcode scanning as well, both for capacity checking and provides people with an alerting system. Public spaces such as libraries and museums also adapted booking system that you can simply use the social media app to register and complete a form and book a time to visit the museums and libraries, which could give the citizens confidence in the space, that they know it's not going to be too crowded. I think this also brings that back to the first point, that it's about making people feel comfortable in public space again with others again. So the lesson here really is that we should embrace technology. We know the technology is already there that can help us. We need to focus in research and on how we can utilize our ability to create new platforms to help analyze, assessing influence, and engaging in ways that we could help people, company, and system to get to a new normal stage. Hopefully the response could trigger some discussion among the audience, and I will now hand over to Carolina for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eco. That's great. It's wonderful that the crisis is danger opportunity, and I think that's sort of what we need to be thinking about now. Is obviously Hank was saying about how more working from home, but I think there's probably an opportunity to have more business change on the back of this and transform to a kind of better normal, and that's really what you want to be doing, be bouncing forward. I'm wondering, Hank, if you could maybe comment on that. Do you see any other sort of larger business change or transformation that might happen on the back of this?
Yeah, I think there are lots. I mean, I think the advances in technology that have been mentioned by all of us are going to become part of the DNA as opposed to an add-on. I think you'll see a significant reduction in business travel, because I think one of the things that we've learned in the last 3 or 4 months is actually you can get quite a lot of business done effectively over a video conferencing without getting on a plane. So I think you'll see you'll see some significant logistical changes. I also think you'll see, certainly from a financial services perspective, a significant move to digital platforms as opposed to the branch network. Banking's been going that way for a number of years, but actually this has significantly speeded up that process, particularly in the markets where there is that penetration of digital technology. It's not the same across the world. So in a number of areas, not just physical occupancy of offices, I think you'll see some significant change.
Yeah, I was wondering whether cash is dead now.
I don't think so. Partly because, again, it's a market dependent thing. So if you go to somewhere like Mexico, where 40% of the transactions are still using checks, whereas the only person that uses a check in England, I think, is probably my mother, who's 90.
Yeah,
right. And that's just symptomatic of the way financial systems work.
Interesting. There's a question here regarding, given that you're an internationally structured corporation, do you have any observations on the form and quality of international governmental cooperation in dealing with COVID-19?
Okay, well, getting myself into political hot water, I shall politically sidestep that by saying, obviously, wherever we are, we have to comply with the local, not just legislation, but also regulation as far as banking services are concerned. It's fair to say that the governments across the world range from being uber conservative to being over lax, and that's sometimes unhelpful. So we're having to restrict our employees far too much in some markets, and not as much as we'd like in others, and that's just symptomatic of the particular government regime. What I would say, though, is one of the lessons that certainly I've learned is that the government permission or the government allowance for you to do certain things or not to do certain things is only one and not the single consideration about whether you either leave your offices and return to contingency sites or home, or the other way around. It's not the sole trigger of what we do and where we do it.
Right. And I think lastly for you, while we've got you speaking, was there anything that surprised you about this whole incident that kind of really took you off guard, that you weren't expecting, and that you would do differently next time?
Yes, good question. I think we've all been surprised unpleasantly by the size and scale of the problems that have been caused. So all in the bank had a pandemic plan, which I sort of dusted off when this first started. The reality is that although you prepare and test for scenarios, nobody prepares and tests for moving everybody in every country you're in almost simultaneously. What I though in terms of lessons learned, and it's a good lesson, is that although me and my people are at times spectacularly unpopular within the bank because we insist on testing people and moving them around and making sure that they can operate in different environments given the need. I think now there's a realization that actually that testing isn't wasted, and actually more time spent testing and doing bigger tests and more significantly impactful tests is probably the best measure of whether you're prepared for something like this.
So it's probably going to have a very obviously positive effect on culture in terms of resilience, because I think people's awareness grows and they start to understand why you're doing that and why being adaptive is important, right?
I think that's right. Although one of the things I've learned from working in a few different countries is that people tend to have rather short memories. So post the massive earthquakes we had when I was in Mexico in 2017, I had sort of 3 months of using with those experiences while still fresh in people's minds to hammer home some lessons. Actually, after about 3 months, those lessons start to fade back into people's memories. So keeping it current is quite a challenge.
No, absolutely. No, that's a fair point. So back to eco, actually. There's a couple of questions sort of on the subject of thinking about, you were talking about kind of adapting kind of urban spaces. I'm wondering how much will now actually get embedded into kind of future design. So whether if we're designing in the UK, we're going to incorporate any of these kind of digital measures in kind of preparation for this type of event.
I think in terms of the technology side of things, I think there's still a huge cultural gap. Like China has already been using those apps for everyday life. I remember I went back home 2 years ago and everything I paid is through the app, and I can't get a taxi without using the app. I can't just like wave on the street. It's already changed in that way, and it just happened that they were able to use that during this pandemic. But I think there is a question mark for the UK and the rest of the world in terms of privacy and security of all these type of things. I think that's something, I mean, to a certain level, I think definitely can be incorporated, but maybe not to the full scale. And I think in terms of things related to urban design and planning, we have been discussing things like during this pandemic, like people feel like neighborhood green space is really important. The big parks sometimes get really crowded, and people start to feel anxious about going to big parks, but they could access to a smaller and more distributed green space. I think that's something that we certainly will look into. Also, things about the travel pattern that will definitely change. Even though we will gradually get back to work, but it's expected a certain percentage of people will still keep remote working, and that will change how people travel and how that gets impact on our network.
Great, thank you. And I think lastly, there's a question here for Ali and around kind of how COVID-19 has exposed the limited resilience of cities. Beyond the immediate priority of everyone's health and livelihoods, the crisis is an opportunity to rethink the way we plan, design, develop and manage our cities to make sure we're better prepared next time. And so the question is, what are the best urban design planning concepts to address the pandemic in the future, which I think is a really interesting question. The other thing I will just plug actually is we have a British standard for city resilience, which was out last year, which is quite a high level guidance standard, which is, I think, will be good pushing at this point in time once people are starting to recover and are starting to prepare again. But I'd be really interested, Ali, in your thoughts on this.
Well, we always believed in resilience. I think the first toolkit which was developed, I was involved in the team back in 2012, which was led by Siemens and Arup at that time. and we actually developed a toolkit, which unfortunately came at the same time, which at the time smart cities were quite popular, and unfortunately, smart sounds much sexier than resilient. And this is the reality that we face. But in fact, resilience and resilient, they are actually more logical in many ways, and we should have thought about this much more. Of course, I know that Arab has taken more projects afterwards on resilient cities. But important for us is that how we can, looking into, at least from my point of view, in terms of how we can look into all inclusiveness in resilience. You know, we have a lot of, and that's how I learned from different, when I developed a framework in early February, and it was actually looking into different resilience frameworks that we have already available in different from different perspectives. We have a lot of actually data and a lot of information, a lot of research available that actually highlights resilience from natural disasters and other crises. But we don't have anything. We don't have much in terms of the outbreak situation, and it is something I think again it would be interesting to look at it from the perspective of research and how our cities would develop. For instance, for sure, densities would be very different. And I think we should think very differently for density. As you can see, I do believe one of the reasons it was announced last week that China announced that they are not going to build any towers more than 500 meters anymore. So this is I think already the starting point of our perceptions to change about density. At least our planning would be very different. We would need to have more regulations, as Eiko mentioned. There would be more emphasis on greener spaces, but not only greener spaces. Having accessibility to greener spaces or something, which is quite important. And those are the things will come up more in future planning regulations and spatial management, spatial planning, and of course urban design level as well. And again, I try to highlight only very few aspects in the public places, and they are again very important in terms of how they may inform our future design thinking. And how we can realize, that this adaptive measures that are, for example, highlighted by Hank earlier in terms of usage of the spaces indoor and in offices. This is exactly the same mentality we should have in outdoor spaces, and how we should start creating, and we have to how we should start creating a bit of perhaps a more innovative urban environment in the future.
Wonderful. No, I think there's some really excellent points there. We could talk all afternoon, couldn't we? But unfortunately, we're running a couple of minutes late now, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw it to a close. I'd just like to thank, on behalf of Resilience First, all the participants, and of course, all you three speakers for a really wonderful conversation today. We will be circulating a short summary and the slides with speakers' permissions. And just want to let you know we have another webinar scheduled for the 20th of May about keeping the nation on track, with speakers from Network Rail and HS1. So thank you so much for attending today, and have a fantastic afternoon. Thank you, everyone.